I now call Shadow Minister Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Well, there's not really a huge amount more to be said about this sham, this con of a bill that hasn't already been said. The plan is as unworkable as it is unaffordable, and that's why Labour would instead repurpose the money that's being squandered and set aside for the scheme into a cross-border police unit and security partnership which would go after the criminal gangs upstream and restore order to our border. And we would create a new returns and enforcement unit to remove people from the country who have no right to be here, given that we have seen the return of failed asylum seekers collapsing by 44% under the Conservatives and the removal of foreign criminals decreased by 27%. Our plan will end the Tory boats chaos, fix our broken asylum system and restore our border security. The government's plan is, as the former immigration minister himself described it, and a civil servant insider has admitted, is to get a few symbolic flights off the ground ahead of a general election, regardless of the wider impact. It really is tokenism and posturing of the worst sort.
I thank my honourable friend for making way on that and highlighting why this is just such a gimmick. Does he agree that when the Permanent Secretary said that there is no evidence it will work as a deterrent, and this plan will only account for just 1% of those crossing the Channel?
Well, she's absolutely right that the test of a policy like this is, will it work as a deterrent? But when you're dealing with people who have risked life and limb to cross continents, they are not going to be put off by a 1% chance of being sent to Rwanda. So the policy fails on its own terms, and the Permanent Secretary was absolutely right to put that red flag on it 2 years ago. It's quite extraordinary that we are where we are today. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and he's making an excellent speech. He spoke about tokenism of the worst sort. Does he agree with me that that was carried on by the Prime Minister's announcement, identifying 25 courtrooms and 150 judges will be available to deal with legal challenges from asylum seekers, giving our courts are struggling with backlogs, partly due to not enough barristers in court. Exactly. So it would be interesting to know how the government would achieve this. Would my honourable friend agree with me?
Oh, she's absolutely right. I'd actually forgotten about that sort of chapter 562 in this never-ending story. And my recollection is that the Prime Minister was then slapped down, I think, by the judiciary, who said, well, we've got a huge amount of a backlog to get through, and this is not a priority. So I think we should thank my honourable friend for reminding the House of yet another sort of disastrous chapter in this story. I will give way.
In the unlikely event of a Labour government, is the Shadow Minister happy with the idea that in future the opposition parties that necessarily and usually dominate the House of Lords should frustrate a Labour government? So will he advise his friends up there to respect the will of the elected House?
I will advise the other place to do what it is doing as a revising chamber, standing up for the constitutional obligations that it has to look at every piece of legislation that we send to them from this place and to take the measures that they feel strongly about. What we are seeing is a set of amendments which in no way prevents this policy from being enacted, in no way prevents flights from taking off. It is simply those members of the other place doing their constitutional duty. But it's not only that the plan is completely unworkable, Mr. Speaker, it is also shockingly unaffordable. It is likely to cost a truly astonishing £2 million per deportee. And to add insult to injury, it puts the tens of thousands of asylum seekers who are deemed inadmissible and yet cannot be sent to Rwanda because of the lack of capacity there. They will be put into limbo in expensive hotels, stuck in a perma backlog at staggering cost to the taxpayer. Dreadful policy, shameful politics. Mr. Speaker, when this bill was first introduced, the Prime Minister described it as emergency legislation, and yet the government's management of the parliamentary timetable would suggest that the opposite is the case. Ministers had ample opportunity to schedule debates and votes on the 25th and 26th of March before Easter recess, but they chose not to do so. And indeed, last week there was also plenty of scope to accelerate this process. So you could be forgiven for concluding that the truth of the matter is that ministers have been deliberately stringing this out for two reasons. Firstly, because they thought that they could make some grubby political capital from the delay. And secondly, because they've been scrambling to get a flight organised and all the other logistics that are not in place. Indeed, the Prime Minister admitted this in his somewhat whinging and buck-passing press conference this morning, that the first flight to Rwanda won't take off until, checks notes, July. I mean, July, really. Today is the 22nd of April. We were initially told that this was emergency legislation, and yet we're now being told that there'll be a 10 to 12-week delay in getting the first flight off the ground. Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't know about what your definition of an emergency is, but a 10 to 12-week response time does seem to be a bit of a stretch. And of course, given that none of the amendments to the bill could by any stretch of the imagination be seen as wrecking amendments, it really is quite difficult to see why the benches opposite couldn't just accept them and get on with it. Because the fundamental point is that not one of the amendments that have been coming to us from the other place would prevent planes from getting into the air. Turning first to the amendment in the name of the noble Lord Hope. Well, this amendment simply reflects what the government has already said, that court judgments are taken at a moment in time, and that a country may well be safe at a given point, but not at another. And that, if this bill passes unamended, then this House will, in essence, be asserting that Rwanda will be a safe country forevermore. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, surely the indisputable lesson of recent times is that we live in a dangerous and turbulent world, where authoritarians are on the march and the rules-based order is under threat. So who knows what might happen in Rwanda in the future, or in any other country for that matter?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. And he will agree with me that, again, the Minister today made the point that just because we've entered into a treaty and we've been told it's safe, that suddenly should be treated as the way forward. Surely that's setting a very serious and dangerous precedent for the future, that we can work our way out of any unsafe country just because we have a treaty with them.
I agree absolutely with my honourable friend, and I thank him for that intervention. I think one of the reasons that we are seeing such a strong pushback from the other place is precisely because they are deeply uncomfortable with trying to make something that is not true. The Supreme Court has ruled unanimously that Rwanda is not a safe country, and yet we are being asked to legislate to say that it is. Now, we can legislate to say that the sky is green and the grass is blue, but that does not make it so, and that is why we have such an important point of principle in this bill.
I thank my honourable friend.
Just before the Honourable Lady makes another intervention, I must draw to the attention of the House that we only have till 5:15 to debate this matter. I have 8 people on the back benches who wish to speak. Their speeches at the moment will be limited to 3 minutes, and it might not be entirely fair for the Honourable Lady to keep meeting. No, but please, Mr. Kinnock.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Courtesy. Mr. Kinnock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you. Therefore, the amendment in the name of the noble Lord Hope simply requires the Home Secretary to lay a statement before Parliament confirming that the Rwanda Treaty has been implemented and that the country is safe. And prior to issuing his statement, the Home Secretary would presumably be taking account of advice provided by the government's hand-picked monitoring committee as specified in the treaty. And of course, Lord Hope's amendment also allows the Home Secretary to lay a statement making clear that Rwanda is no longer safe should the situation on the ground in Rwanda change. This trust but verify approach is embedded in countless pieces of legislation that have made their way onto the statute book over the centuries. It is a perfectly fair, measured, reasonable and non-controversial proposal, and frankly it's simply bizarre and incomprehensible that the government is refusing to accept it. Turning now to the amendment in the name of the noble Lord Brown, frankly, I just don't know where to start with this one, Madam Deputy Speaker. It beggars belief that the government is still insisting on being able to deport Afghans who have bravely fought alongside British forces against the Taliban to Rwanda. It really is shameful that we are still debating what should be a given. We owe a debt of gratitude to the Afghans who stood shoulder to shoulder with our troops, and yet this government is seeking to trash our reputation as a country that honours its debts. What a disgrace. Ministers should hang their heads in shame. Now, over the course of the last few weeks, they've deployed a variety of spurious and mealy-mouthed arguments to defend their position. But the one they have most frequently used is that there are already safe and legal routes in place in the shape of the ARAP and ACRS schemes. But this is simply not the case, Madam Deputy Speaker. Operation Warm Welcome became Operation Cold Shoulder when the Prime Minister torpedoed both schemes and left these Afghans stranded. Shocking but true. Court documents show that in November 2022, the Prime Minister issued instructions to halt flights from neighbouring Pakistan for an entire year for Afghans who had already been granted resettlement rights in the UK, and only restarted them when the Pakistani government threatened to send these heroic individuals back across the border to meet their fate at the hands of the Taliban. Just let the content of those court documents sink in, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom explicitly instructed the Ministry of Defence and the Home Office to stop assisting Afghans who had put their lives on the line for our country. What a disgrace. What a betrayal of British values. What a hammer blow to our moral standing in the world. But the noble Lord Brown's amendment is not only driven by a basic moral imperative, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is also driven by our national interest and by military logic, for the simple and obvious reason that the ability of our armed forces to recruit local allies to support us in the future will be severely constrained if this bill passes unamended. It should therefore not come as a surprise to anyone that our armed forces are outraged and repelled by the government's refusal to accept Lord Brown's amendment. Indeed, just last weekend, 13 senior military figures signed a letter to the Sunday Telegraph stating robustly that any brave men and women, and I quote, who have fought alongside our armed forces or served the UK government overseas must be exempt from removal to Rwanda. Madam Deputy Speaker, I therefore urge all those across the House to join with me in supporting these two amendments that are in front of us today. This whole process has been a farce, but if we can just pass these amendments, we can at least send a message that we are not a country that chooses to deport its military allies to a country on the other side of the world, and that we are a country that cares about whether or not we are sending some of the most vulnerable people on the planet to a place which is safe for them. At the very least, we owe that basic level of respect and decency to ourselves as a nation and to the people that this policy will affect. Unfortunately, respect and decency for anyone, whether it's in relation to our nation, to asylum seekers, or indeed to the British taxpayer, is not something that this Prime Minister and his government hold in any regard whatsoever. And that is why their time is up. They are not fit to govern. And I fear tonight that they will demonstrate that point in spades yet again. Thank you, Madam.